And so the actuality of the questions and the teachings that we find in Mark chapter 9, verse 50, where Jesus is talking about salt, and he said, how is it that you can put the savor back in the salt? Because if it's lost its saltiness, then it becomes of no effect. And throughout this week, we've talked about the covenant of salt that we find in the Old Testament, where it says that when they offered a sacrifice, it was a very special sacrifice. It would be very, very salty. And I explained to you how that many times in the East, they would use salt as a type of a very special act, as it was when David was inaugurated to be the king of Israel. They did it with a covenant of salt. So now, what does this mean to us? Because there was a couple questions or comments that went along with this. It said, have salt in yourself. This is the second part of that verse. And have peace with one another. As I told you yesterday, you have to go back in the scriptures to find out, how did we get to this finality of this discourse? And it all began with two of the disciples who were asking a particular favor. They wanted to know if one could sit on the right hand and one could sit on the left hand of Jesus in paradise. And Jesus gave them a long lecture about this. And he talked about, he says, do you think that you could follow after this and take up your cross and follow me? And they said, oh, yes, we can. And Jesus really began to explain to them just exactly how it was, that they didn't even know what they were talking about. But when the other disciples heard of this, they were very, very upset about it. And they came to Jesus, and they brought their complaints about this request. And Jesus began to tell them about the heart and the attitude of a person who is to serve the Lord with humility. And he picked up a little child, and he held the child toward them, and explained to them that if you want to serve in the kingdom of God, you must do it as humbly, like a child. Well, see, this brings us back to the question of the seasoning of the salt, or the saltiness of the salt. And it has to do with heart and relationship. And what happens if somebody sets out to follow Christ and to be a sincere servant of Jesus, but somewhere along the way, their heart gets distracted. And as it says in the parable of the sower, it says that the deceitfulness of riches and the cares of this world begins to steal their heart. And the tanginess of the relationship and their quest to serve him begins to dim. And the question comes, how could you cause the salt to regain its saltiness? Well, that's what Jesus is trying to explain to us. And we'll continue this tomorrow's broadcast. This is Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.